Now that we understand the basics behind the infrastructure service or virtual machines, let's go ahead and deploy a virtual machine within the Azure portal. All right, you can see here we're signed into our Azure portal. Our goal today is to create a new virtual machine. So we'll go up to VM here. If, for example, that wasn't listed, you can always go up top and type search for virtual. And here you can see from services, we have that option. So we'll go ahead and select it. We do have 2 existing virtual machines listed out already. Our goal is to create a third. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up here and click add and select virtual machine. Once this loads up, you can see this looks pretty similar to when we created a resource group, except now we have a lot more options. So for resource groups, we're going to go ahead and hit the drop down and we're going to select Skylines. Now we need to start filling out some information about the virtual machine. So we'll go ahead and give it a name. Skylines VM001. For the region, we're going to leave this in Central US region. The resources that you deploy don't have to be in the same region that your resource group was created in. It's typically a good idea, but not a hard requirement. We're not going to select any availability options of availability sets or availability zones, so we'll just leave that set to no. For the image, you can see here we can select the operating system or the image that we're going to load onto the virtual machine. You got Ubuntu, RHEL, SUSE, so on and so forth. You also have a number of Windows options here. We're going to leave this with the default of Ubuntu 18.04. And then here we can select the size or the SKU. So if we hit the drop down here, you can see we've got some of our recently selected options. FS1 or standard DS2. If you wanted something beyond that though, you can scroll down here and say see all sizes. Once we have the list up here, you can see there's a number of options to choose from. We're going to go ahead, since this is just a demo, we're going to set it to where we have a maximum number of vCPUs to 1, and we'll hit OK here. And now you can see we've got this list filtered out. If you scroll off to the right, you can kind of get a rough estimate of cost per month. If we go ahead and select the drop down there, so we're sorting by cost per month, you can see we've got a number of pretty simple options here. Since this is just a small Ubuntu box, we'll go ahead and select this one. You can see, as we learned, if it's got the M&S, that means it supports additional memory as well as has premium disk support. So you can see here, premium disks is supported. And if we look at B1S, it has 1 gig of memory. Or if we look at B1MS, it has 2 gigs of memory. So we'll go ahead and select this. And you can see once this loads up, we'll have a price here shortly. Might take a little bit. In the meantime, now we'll go ahead and set our authentication to this. With Linux virtual machines, you have the option to use a SSH public key, or if you want to use a password. We're going to go ahead and select password for this, and we'll define a username as well. Again, if we type admin, and you can see it'll fail here because usernames must not include reserved words. So we'll go ahead and do Skylines admin. And it likes that. We'll give it a generic password here, not too generic. And then here you can see we've got inbound port rules. So since this is a demonstration VM and we don't have any existing networking in place in order to connect to this, the typical option is to set up a public inbound port, or basically allow us to connect to this server using SSH over the public internet. If you have an existing networking in place that has a secure connection, whether that's VPN or an express route, then typically I would recommend avoiding this because you should connect to that VM using the existing secure network. Since that's not the case or not applicable in this instance, we'll go ahead and leave that as default. So we'll select disks, and then here we can select our disk type. Again, you can select the various storage type, standard HDD, which is spinning disk, and then you've got your 2 tiers of SSDs. If you have some existing data disk that you would like to attach, or if you wanted to create a new data disk, you have that option here. We're going to leave the defaults, and then now we're going to go into the networking side of it. You can see here it's going to create a new virtual network for us. If we wanted to connect to an existing virtual network, we can select the drop down, and you can see we've got the 2 virtual networks there. Since we want this one to be isolated, we'll leave that as a default. It's going to create a new subnet within that virtual network for us, as well as create a public IP address. And we'll leave the networking security group or NSG settings as default. We'll talk about those in a later module. Now, if we go to management, you can see here we have a couple of basic options. We configure some monitoring for it, some identities, so if we want to manage identity or integrate it with Azure Active Directory, as well as some additional options, if we wanted to automatically shut down or enable backup. We have those options, just the same as if you're deploying a virtual machine in on-premise data center. Are we going to monitor? How are we going to monitor? How are we going to back up? What are we going to use for authentication? So we have all those same ideas or concepts here. We're going to leave all these as default for this instance. If we go to advanced, now we also have the option to where we can run some custom commands. So if you were setting up a LAMP server, for example, you could have a script that installed Apache, MySQL, and Python already available. You could copy that script into here so it would execute when the VM's provisioned and have all of those already installed when we first connect. We're not going to do anything with this instance. We'll just go ahead and leave those defaults. For tags here, we're going to go ahead and set a tag of tech contact, and we'll leave that as me. And then now we'll go to review and create. So you can see here that it's past validation. You can see we're going to get roughly a cost. So it's going to cost us between 2 and 3 cents an hour to run this virtual machine. And then also lets us know that SSH has been opened up to the internet, so we can connect on port 22. Again, it flags it. It's not a best practice, but since this is a demonstration, that's okay. For a production environment, though, I certainly don't recommend that. Additionally, this is also going to check any policies that you have. So you can see here, validation passed, but if we had an Azure policy in place that says no SSH or RDP example allowed to public internet, since we'd have that, this would fail. It would say that we can't create the virtual machine because it did not meet all of the policy requirements, and it would specify what policy it had failed or what policy had caused that validation to fail. In this case, everything's good, so we're going to go ahead and select create. And this can take a couple minutes for it to get deployed, so we'll go ahead and sit tight here and we'll come back once this is done. So you can see here we've got our VM that was successfully completed. If we click go to resource here, we can see now we've got our virtual machine that's up and running. Now let's go ahead and connect to that machine to make sure it's working like we anticipated. So we're going to go over here. I'm going to click on this to copy the IP address. And we're going to go ahead and open Windows Terminal here. So now we're going to go ahead and SSH in that machine. So SSH and then Skylines admin @ and then we'll paste that IP address in. And looks like we're getting a prompt here to accept that certificate. We'll go ahead and hit yes. And now it's prompting us for the password. We're going to go ahead and enter the password that we set when we provisioned the virtual machine. And perfect. Looks like we're signed on here. We can see we've got our username, Skylines admin @ SkylinesVM01. So it looks like everything's working like it should. Perfect. Now let's go back and take a little bit closer look at the networking and network security groups.